Picking up from our last discussion on the selfless mind and its basic elements, we naturally arrive at a deeper question. Why do we feel so fundamentally uneasy when we start questioning the very ground beneath our cognitive feet? Specifically, what's so threatening about challenging the idea that the world out there has fixed properties, and our minds are just mirrors reflecting them? Our gut reaction, our common sense, often tells us, what other way could the mind and world relate? It feels almost like asking a silly question. But hold on, isn't this exactly the kind of philosophical navel-gazing that scientists usually tell us to ignore? The text argues quite compellingly that these aren't just philosophical curiosities. They are deep-seated assumptions embedded in the very foundations of cognitive science itself. We need to ask, what's the scientific basis for assuming cognition is merely a processor reacting to pre-given environmental features? Why do we take it for granted that cognitive science can't question these notions of representation and information processing, not just philosophically, but in its actual research? Now, here's the kicker. Even as ideas about representation and information processing evolve dramatically, think about connectionism, neural networks, emergence, self-organization, some core realist assumptions stubbornly remain. It's like upgrading your car engine, but still believing the road ahead is fixed and unchanging. In explicit cognitivism, this realist stance is often laid bare. But even in emergentist approaches, where things get fuzzier, it often lurks beneath the surface, taken for granted. This isn't just an academic footnote. The text warns us this unexamined attitude is a major risk. It acts like intellectual blinders, limiting the range of theories we consider, potentially stifling innovation, and ultimately constraining the future of cognitive science itself. We might be missing out on revolutionary insights simply because we're stuck in an old paradigm. And this unease isn't just a fringe feeling. The text points out that a growing number of researchers across various cognitive science fields are expressing genuine dissatisfaction. This isn't just about getting tired of symbol processing or the complexities of the society of mind model. It's something deeper. It's a dissatisfaction with the very concept of cognition as a representational system. Why? Because, the argument goes, this representational lens actually obscures crucial aspects of cognition. Think about it. How well does the idea of internal representations capture the richness of perception, the nuances of language, or the dynamics of evolution and life itself? It seems like we're trying to understand a vibrant interactive dance using only a static photograph as our guide. This suggests that the representational framework, while useful perhaps as a starting point, might be fundamentally inadequate for grasping the full picture. Okay, before we go further, let's clarify what we mean by representation. There are two key senses here, and confusing them is where things get tricky. First, there's the weak sense, which is pretty uncontroversial. Think of it purely semantically. Something is a representation if it can be interpreted as being about something else. A map represents terrain, right? Words on a page represent sentences, which in turn can represent objects or events. Even formally, propositions represent conditions of satisfaction. Snow is white represents the condition that snow is indeed white. This weak sense is pragmatic. We use it all the time without needing to delve into deep ontological questions. We can say a map represents terrain without needing to figure out the metaphysics of map meaning. It's just about interpretation. But then comes the strong sense. This is where the philosophical heavy lifting happens. Here we generalize that weak interpretive idea into a powerful explanatory theory. And this is where the big commitments kick in. The strong sense of representationalism rests on three pillars. First, an ontological commitment. The world is pre-given. Its features exist independently of our cognition, ready to be specified before any cognitive activity begins. Second, an epistemological commitment. Our cognition relates to this pre-given world, albeit perhaps imperfectly or partially. Third, a mechanistic hypothesis. The way we know this world is by forming internal representations of its features and then acting based on those representations. Think back to our metaphor. An agent dropped into a world that already exists. To survive, the agent needs a map, a set of innate representations, maybe a language of thought, and then learns how to use that map through development. That's the core of the strong realist view. Now, you might hear cognitive scientists push back, saying, hold on, isn't that a caricature? Perception isn't just a mirror. We know it's an active process full of hypothesis formation and inference. Absolutely true. Take David Marr's work on vision. He talks about recovering shape from edges, color from reflectance. It sounds incredibly sophisticated, far removed from a simple reflection. And yet the text argues this objection misses the point. The caricature isn't meant to dismiss the complexity of research programs. Instead, it's designed to highlight the underlying epistemological assumptions that persist even in these advanced models. Even when we talk about recovering properties, we're still operating under the assumption that those properties, shape, color, are extrinsic, independent features of the environment waiting to be discovered or reconstructed by the system. The fundamental idea of a pre-given world hasn't vanished. It's just become more sophisticatedly hidden within the machinery. So, how did cognitive science try to navigate the classic philosophical trap between realism and idealism? Enter Willard Van Orman Quine and his famous idea of naturalizing epistemology. The traditional debate revolved around a priori representations, ideas supposedly providing a non-contingent foundation for knowledge. Quine shifted the focus to a posteriori representations, ones whose content ultimately derives from causal interactions with the environment. This seemed like a clever escape route. By grounding representation in empirical, causal relations studied by psychology and neuroscience, cognitive science could seemingly sidestep the skeptical worries that plagued traditional epistemology. Adopting this naturalized stance, scientists felt they could maintain a firm grip on empirical reality while exploring the intricate details of the mind, avoiding both the metaphysical abyss of solipsism and the rigid dogma of classical realism. But Richard Rorty, ever the insightful critic, pointed out a crucial subtlety. Yes, cognitive science successfully banishes the traditional skeptical questions about accessing an independent world. But does that mean the underlying image of the mind as a mirror of nature is gone? Not really, Rorty argued. The core assumption remains. There's still a world out there with predetermined features, and our task is to recover or represent those features through some process. Cognitive science, ironically, might be the most vigorous expression of this representationalist view since Descartes and Locke, simply because it uses the computer as its model. As Jerry Fodor bluntly put it, the main advance of cognitivism over older representationalism wasn't a change in the core idea, but just swapping the clockwork automaton for a digital computer. The mirror metaphor, it seems, just got a new frame. However, cracks begin to show in this representational edifice, especially when we look at emergentist approaches and Minsky's society of mind. The focus starts to subtly shift. We move away from seeing the mind primarily as a black box processing inputs from a pre-given world to produce outputs. Instead, the mind emerges as a complex network of interacting agents or processes. The environment fades into the background, becoming less the primary reference point and more the context. What takes center stage is the mind as an autonomous, self-organizing system. And this raises a profound question. If the mind is fundamentally about internal dynamics and relationships, what, if anything, in these networks truly counts as representational? The very concept starts to feel ill-fitting. Let's bring Marvin Minsky into the picture. Towards the end of his book, he makes a striking observation. When we speak of a mind, we speak of processes that carry our brain from one state to another. The concern is about the relation between states, not the nature of the states themselves. Okay, fair enough. But how do we understand these relations? The standard answer, the one we've been discussing, is that these processes enact or support representations of the external world. But here's the rub. If we insist that the function of these brain processes is to represent an independent world, we're implicitly treating the brain as a heteronomous system, one controlled from the outside, taking pre-specified information as input and producing behavior as output. But how do you define inputs and outputs for something as complex and self-modifying as a brain? Where does the information end and the behavior begin? Minsky himself highlights this difficulty. And then Minsky delivers the punchline. He asks why processes are so hard to classify, contrasting brains with factories. Brains, he says, use processes that change themselves. You can't neatly separate the process from its product. They create memories which then change how we think. The main activity of the brain, he concludes, is creating changes within itself. Notice what's missing here. Nowhere does he mention representing the external world. The focus shifts entirely inward to the dynamic process of self-modification. So where did the representational idea go? It seems to have quietly evaporated when faced with the reality of self-organizing systems. This suggests that maybe the representational framework wasn't capturing the essence of mental processes after all. This leads to a significant shift happening right now within cognitive science, driven by the challenges encountered in studying complex systems. It requires us to move beyond the comfortable notion of a world that stands apart, independent, and extrinsic. Instead, we need to embrace the idea of a world that is inseparable from the structure of these self-modifying processes. This isn't just a philosophical preference, it's becoming necessary for understanding cognition scientifically. How? By focusing on operational closure. Imagine a system where the outputs of its processes become the inputs for further processes within the same system. It's like a self-contained loop. Such systems are autonomous, they organize themselves from within, rather than being externally controlled, heteronomous systems. The key insight is that these autonomous systems don't operate by representing a world out there. Instead, they enact a world. They create a domain of distinctions that is fundamentally tied to the structure of the system itself. Alright, so we've seen why the representationalist view feels problematic, especially when dealing with self-organizing systems. But why does this idea that there must be a pre-given world, or at least prepared information, feel so deeply ingrained? Why do we feel like we have to cling to it, otherwise everything falls apart? The text introduces a fascinating concept here, Cartesian anxiety named after René Descartes. This anxiety stems from a fundamental dilemma, a kind of binary choice we seem stuck in. On one hand, we crave a fixed, stable foundation for knowledge, a place where certainty begins. On the other hand, if we can't find such a foundation, the alternative seems equally terrifying, plunging into darkness, chaos, and confusion. It's an either-or situation. Either there's absolute ground or everything collapses. This intense desire for certainty is the root of the anxiety. Immanuel Kant beautifully captures this Cartesian anxiety in his Critique of Pure Reason. He builds his entire theory of knowledge around the idea that we possess innate categories, a priori structures, that form the bedrock of all our understanding. At the end of his analysis, he uses this powerful metaphor. Knowledge is like an island of truth, surrounded by a vast and stormy ocean of illusion. Inside the island, everything is clear, well-defined, and firmly grounded. Outside, it's a swirling mess of darkness and confusion. This image perfectly encapsulates the Cartesian dilemma, the desperate search for that secure island of absolute truth, fearing utter dissolution if such an island cannot be found. It's the allure of certainty against the terror of the void. This anxiety plays out as a constant oscillation between seeking that absolute foundation, externally in the world, or internally in the mind. It treats the mind and the world as fundamental opposites, subjective versus objective. But here's a crucial point. This sharp division between subject and object wasn't always there. It's a historical construct, a product of Western thought, particularly highlighted by thinkers like Richard Bernstein and Richard Rorty. Consider the word idea. Before Descartes, it was typically used to refer to the content of God's mind. Descartes was among the first to apply it to human mental functioning. This linguistic and conceptual shift is part of what Rorty calls the invention of the mind as a mirror of nature. The subject-object split is a relatively recent development in our intellectual history. Our current predicament is particularly interesting because we're increasingly skeptical about the possibility of finding any ultimate, final foundation. When Cartesian anxiety arises today, it often doesn't lead to the frantic search for external or internal ground anymore. Instead, it tends to spiral directly into nihilism. Why? Because we haven't quite learned how to let go of the ingrained habit of seeking foundations. Look again at Minsky's response to the impossibility of knowing a totally independent world. He says essentially, we only express our beliefs. This offers a kind of self-awareness, but it carries a distinct tone of melancholy. Where does this melancholy come from? The text argues it arises precisely from the Cartesian ideal, the expectation that knowledge should be a perfect representation of a pre-given world. When that ideal proves impossible to achieve, a sense of loss and despair sets in. This melancholy is deeply tied to the logic of the Cartesian dilemma. The ideal is that knowledge should represent a pre-given world. When that fails, the search inevitably turns inward, seeking refuge in internal representations as a substitute foundation. But here lies the irony, highlighted by Minsky's own words. When he says we only express our beliefs, he's essentially falling back into the very trap he helped illuminate. He's retreating to the idea of a solitary Cartesian self, trapped inside its own representations, hoping to find stability there. And the kicker, Minsky himself, in his work on the Society of Mind, explicitly doubts the existence of a substantial, unified self that could serve as such an internal foundation. So the logic of the dilemma pushes us towards a dead end, either a world we can't access or a self we can't find. Both paths lead towards nihilism. Now, let's connect this back to our earlier exploration of mindfulness and open awareness practices. There we saw that attachment to an internal foundation, the belief in a stable, independent self, is a primary source of frustration and suffering. What the text now reveals is that this attachment to an internal foundation is just one manifestation of a broader pattern. Our deep-seated tendency to seek attachment to some kind of foundation, whether it's internal or external. The core insight begins to emerge. It's this very tendency to cling to foundations, whether it's the self or the pre-given world, that is the root cause of our anxiety and frustration. This perspective resonates strongly with the core teaching of the Madhyamika school in Buddhist philosophy, which advocates for a middle way precisely to navigate this impasse. The Madhyamika analysis offers a powerful diagnosis of this predicament. It identifies the root cause, this habitual tendency to seek attachment, as leading inevitably to two extremes. First, absolutism, the attempt to find an ultimate, self-existing foundation, svabhava, for everything, either within the self or in the external world. Second, nihilism. When the search for this absolute foundation inevitably fails, the mind retreats and clings to the very absence of foundations, dismissing everything else as illusory. Two critical points emerge from this analysis. First, it explicitly recognizes that the fundamentalist project includes our belief in a pre-given world, external absolutism, not just the internal self, internal absolutism. This connection is often overlooked in Western philosophy. Second, and perhaps most importantly, Madhyamika explicitly links absolutism and nihilism, showing them as two sides of the same coin, both born from the same root, the desperate need to attach. Within our mindfulness traditions, the practice aims to cultivate a direct, stable apprehension of both absolutism and nihilism as forms of attachment arising from the ego-seeking tendency. Gradually, by loosening this grip, practitioners begin to perceive that all phenomena lack inherent absolute foundations. This fundamental lack of foundation, this emptiness, shunyata, is not nothingness, but rather the very condition for the rich, nuanced, and interdependent world of experience we actually live in. Phenomenologically, we could say that the lack of a fixed foundation is precisely what allows for the dynamic, contextual, and codependently originated reality we navigate every day. It's not some remote philosophical abstraction. It's revealed in the very way we make sense of and interact with a world that is constantly being shaped and reshaped through our actions and perceptions. Interestingly, cognitive science has largely resisted this perspective, often dismissing it as mere folk psychology or lacking scientific rigor. The tendency remains to continue framing cognition primarily as problem-solving within tasks that are somehow pre-given or fixed. However, the text suggests that the true strength of living cognition lies elsewhere, in its remarkable ability to pose relevant problems within broad constraints, rather than simply solving problems that are handed down to it. These problems aren't discovered in a pre-existing list, they are enacted, brought into being through our ongoing engagement with the world. What counts as relevant is determined dynamically, contextually by our common sense and our situated actions within a constantly unfolding background. So, wrapping up this section, the core argument presented is a powerful critique of the dominant representationalist paradigm in cognitive science. It challenges the assumption that cognition is fundamentally about passively reflecting or representing a pre-given world. Instead, it proposes a shift towards understanding cognition as an active process of enacting or bringing forth a world through dynamic, self-organizing, and embodied processes. This perspective promises to open up new horizons for understanding perception, language, evolution, and the very nature of mind itself, moving beyond the limitations of the mirror metaphor.